I was at a battle called Contienne, which was in September of 1967, and I was a tank platoon leader in the Marine Corps. And I have written both of these books. And since this was on my mind a lot, and then a little bit artistic, I designed this diorama, which typifies what we experienced when I was at Contienne. And this is what it pretty much looked like. That's my tank, my M48A3, and that would be me sitting up there in the tank commander's cupola. And I have a 105 millimeter howitzer battery. This is an Amtrak. That's what we call a mule, which was a little battery-driven vehicle that we would haul supplies around with. And I also have a few Marines going through their mundane daily tasks, like picking up sea rations for their meals and what have you. Why did I write these books? Well, I was in a very famous battle called the Battle for Contienne, and it got a lot of coverage in 1967. In fact, Life magazine devoted this issue to the Battle for Contienne, and they have 14 pages of photographs in this issue. And that's how important it was. And people are asking me on this book, why did I name it Time in the Barrel? Someone said, didn't you mean time in the bottle? No, it was meant to be time in the barrel, because the expression that we shared with each other when we were going up to Contienne was, they would say, hey, you going up to Contienne? Yes, I am, and you're going to do some time in the barrel, which came from the expression, as easy as shooting fish in a barrel. And the reason for that was the fire base Contienne was about 2 city blocks in size. And we had a battalion of Marines, a tank platoon, Amtrak unit, a battery of 105 howitzers, mortars. We had them all crammed into this place, and we were all living in bunkers and trenches, taking incoming artillery and mortars from up in the demilitarized zone. The North Vietnamese Army wanted us to leave that place, and I'll explain later why it was so important to everybody. I got started writing when I came home from Vietnam. I was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, pretty severe. I was single, didn't really have anyone to speak with about it. So I started writing at night, and I would remember things. I also kept a diary while I was in Vietnam, so I'd remember things that happened, and I would write them down. And after a number of years, I had a notebook full of handwritten notes about a couple inches thick. And I got married in 1976, and my bride looked at it and said, you know, this would make a good book, Jim. So she sat down with her Smith Corona and proceeded to type all those notes into a manuscript. And woe is me. No publisher wanted it. This was 1979, 1980. I think people were tired of the Vietnam War. So anyway, this first book, Contienne, the Hill of Angels, is about the battle for Contienne. It's not about me. This second book I wrote and had recently published by University of Alabama Press. Both of these books are published by University of Alabama Press.
Where can I get them?
And they can be ordered at Amazon or through Amazon. And this first book was published in 2004. The second book was published in 2019.
Where's Contienne in Vietnam?
Contienne is if you look at this map of the Quang Tri province, which was the northernmost province in South Vietnam, and it abutted the demilitarized zone. I'll get into in a little bit where the term demilitarized zone came from and how it happened. But Con Thien was about a mile south of the southern border of the demilitarized zone. And it was part of what they call Leatherneck Square. The Marines called it Leatherneck Square because it's a rough square with Con Thien, Jo Lin, Dong Ha, and Cam Lo. And those were all Marine Corps bases, Marine Corps Army. And the Qua Viet River came in off the South China Sea. And that was also an important waterway because the Navy would bring in supplies to us through this Qua Viet River. Let me talk a little bit about me. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and my house was about 3 blocks from the University of Arizona campus. And I used to see the university ROTC students, Air Force and Army, walking to and from class. And I took an instant dislike to the idea of having to wear a uniform on campus. So when I graduated high school in 1960, a friend and I went down to the Army National Guard, the Arizona Army National Guard, and I joined. And so while I was going to college, I was a guardsman. And then everything was going real well until going into my senior year, I got involved in a fraternity prank that turned out pretty bad. And I was suspended from school for a semester, and I was charged with a misdemeanor, along with the rest of us, of tampering with a motor vehicle. So when I came back to school, I decided that I was going to show the dean of students a thing or two, and I made straight A's my last year in college, and then I graduated. But there wasn't much of a market for graduates with a degree in public administration, but I finally got a job with Sears as a credit manager trainee. So it's 1966, the war is going on in Vietnam, and I'm watching it on television every night. And this Marine officer came on the screen, and he was being interviewed about a battle he was in. And I thought, this guy is really sharp. You know, I think maybe I'm going to try to be on his team. So I applied for officer candidate school, was accepted on a waiver because I did have an arrest record, but it was a misdemeanor. But they needed officer material then, so I got accepted. And I went to officer candidate school at Quantico. They'd cut it down from 12 weeks to 10 weeks, and it was more concentrated. I thought I was in good physical shape, having played sports in high school, football, track, wrestled, etc. It was nothing like OCS. It was the toughest experience physically and mentally that I ever gone through. Out of the 50 of us in my platoon that started OCS, on graduation day, there were only 29 of us still left standing in formation. Then it was on to the basic school for 4.5 more months, and then it was on to Camp Pendleton for tank school. August 10th of 1967, I arrived in Phu Bai, and I was one of 9 second lieutenants that went north. There were 18 of us all together. 9 went north and 9 went south. The 9 of us that went north, 2 were killed, and all the rest were wounded except for 1. And that wasn't me. One thing that really brought home to me what this experience could be was one night a South Vietnamese Army artillery unit misfired, and the artillery shell landed on a hooch. That's what we called a hut. Hooch full of Navy Seabees, and helicopters started flying. Medevac helicopters were coming in that night over and over and over again. So couple of us got curious, and we went over to see what happened. And I noticed that on just about every cot in that hooch had bloody sheets. And almost everyone who was in that location that night was either killed or wounded. And it brought home to me that if this can happen by accident, what can happen in when the real thing happens? So I was brought into the colonel's office after about a month at Fubai, and he said, "Jim, we're going to have to send you up to Contienne. The lieutenant that's up there has been wounded twice in 2 weeks." And hey, this is what I signed on for. I wanted to see some action. So, and he said, "Jim, whatever you do, don't make a mistake on reporting your casualties, because that information gets sent back home to the families, and you don't want to be mistaken about that. And the other thing, Jim, is you're going to have a platoon sergeant who's been in the Marine Corps 18 years. He's a Korean War vet. He's forgotten more about tanks than you know. You got that?" "Yeah, aye, aye, sir." And so that was my send-off to go up to Contienne, and I arrived on September 10th, right in the middle of the siege that was going on. And I call it a siege, or they called it a siege, because we were surrounded by 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers within a day's march of that location. And we were taking incoming artillery, rockets, and mortars intermittently throughout the day. And so that's why it was called the Siege of Contienne. The day I got there, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines was pulling out, and they were being relieved by the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines. And so I'm a brand new platoon leader, and I've got a Canadian as my driver. Bert had been in the Canadian Army and decided to go to college, and then somehow got himself into the United States and into the Marine Corps. He was my age, 25. So I wrote about this in my book on Time in the Barrel. And Bert pulled out a warm can of beer and took his bayonet and stabbed it in there and handed it to me and said, "Welcome to the fighting 1st Platoon, sir." So I was never been a fan of warm beer, but I drank it anyway. Contienne was, I had the 5 tanks in my platoon, and though those tanks were located around the perimeter of Contienne, which was basically a circle, on the northern part of the perimeter, there were 3 hills, 3 small hills connected by a saddle. But what the North Vietnamese saw when they looked in our direction is all they saw was the hills. They didn't see what was on the reverse slope. That's where the artillery and the mortars and our battalion aid station, all of that was on the other side of those, on the reverse slope of those hills. But why Contienne? What was going on that made Contienne important? If you look, my map here, all this terrain around Contienne for miles was essentially flat, ancient rice paddy country. And then sticking up out of the middle of nowhere were these 3 hills. And some French missionaries looked at it and decided there was something angelic about those hills rising up out of the plain. And so that became the name Contienne, the Hill of Angels. Within 4 or 5 miles of Contienne in several directions were Catholic churches. There were a lot of Catholics resided in that area. So, again, what was important about Contienne? if you stood atop one of those three hills, you could see for many miles in every direction. We called the tops of those hillocks outposts or OPs. So OP1 faced to the northwest. The center hill, OP2, faced directly north, and OP3, which was on the eastern hill, faced pretty much to the east. You could see all the way to the South China Sea from that location. If you turned around and looked south, you could see 10 miles south to where the Marines had a fire base and called Charlie 3, and they also had a supply base called Dong Ha. And connecting, I'll show this again, connecting Contien and Jolin was a bulldozed strip, looked like a giant golf course fairway. It was 6 miles long and initially 200 meters wide, and then it was extended out to 600 meters wide. And the purpose of this thing was, it was because of our Secretary of Defense McNamara and his whiz kids decided the way to stop the infiltration across the demilitarized zone was to build these strong points, and it was called Strong Point Obstacle System, SPOS. Contien was the linchpin of that because of the outstanding observation from that location. And now you're probably wondering, when we talk about demilitarized zone, how did that happen? It had origins back in 1954 when, after this, at the end of the Korean War, and the French had suffered a major defeat at Dien Bien Phu up in northern part of Vietnam. And so the Big Four at Geneva decided that they were going to stop figuring out what they were going to do about Korea, and they were going to focus on Vietnam because of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And it was agreed that the two parts of Vietnam, the north part and the south part, would be separated at the 17th parallel by a 5-mile wide demilitarized zone. And it just so happened that going through the middle of this demilitarized zone was the Ben Hai River. And the demilitarized zone went clear across Vietnam and into the border with Laos. Well, it didn't take the North Vietnamese long to start taking advantage of the demilitarized zone, that it was no longer demilitarized. They were bringing their troops into the zone. They were bringing in artillery. They were starting to attack from that location. And the question is, well, why didn't we go in there after them? Well, there was a real fear that we didn't want a repeat of what happened in the Korean War when we went up to Chosin Reservoir and up to the Yalu River, and then the Chinese communists came in, and then we were in a major war with them. So the reason we held back was because we didn't want to have another Korean War situation. We did fire artillery up in the DMZ, we did bomb them, but we never really sent any of our Marines or soldiers in there on foot, or tanks. So I described the strong point obstacle system, the trace, and what that was about. And then then on May 8th was a major attack on Contien. The reason for May 8th, we believe, is that that's the anniversary, 13th anniversary of the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu. And the Vietnamese general was General Giap, G-I-A-P, who was also one of the main players in Dien Bien Phu. So on this May 8th attack, the Marines had been tasked with not only building these strong point, but that they were asked to clear out that trace. And so we had a lot of engineers working on it, Marine engineers from the 11th Engineer Battalion. But the South Vietnamese pulled out and left Con Tien being protected by the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines. The 1st Battalion, 4th Marines dug in, and they were protecting the engineers working on this trace, and they were also protecting the fire base. Well, this attack happened on May 8th, and they actually overran the perimeter, and quite a few Marines and Navy Seabees and engineers, quite a few of them were casualties in this attack. But what they ran into, there were 3 tanks assigned to that location, and they put up such a fight that they were able to stop the North Vietnamese incursion through the perimeter. They were able to stop them there, along with the help from the engineers and the artillery folks that grabbed rifles and came to help out. 2 of the Marine tankers received the Navy Cross that night. The platoon sergeant that was with them got the Silver Star. And of the 12 tank crewmen, 11 of them were wounded. Only 1 survived without being wounded. Then on July 2nd of 1967, there was this Operation Buffalo. And Operation Buffalo became a disaster for a company of Marines, Bravo, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. They walked into probably a regimental-sized North Vietnamese unit, and they were ambushed. And this battle went on most of the day, and out of the whole company of Marines, Bravo company, only 26 walked out unwounded. So that began several battles in that DMZ, Leatherneck Square, Trace area for the rest of July into August. Eventually, the Marines were able to make some retribution because of what happened to Bravo. But all it did was just escalate into shelling of Con Tien and another base there, Jolin. I had a platoon sergeant, Gunny Hopkins, and he was from West Virginia, had that kind of accent, knew all the words to the country western songs, and but he and I hit it off. I was a boot lieutenant. He was an experienced gunnery sergeant. He'd been in 18 years, and so fortunately he and I hooked up and got along real well and worked together. Third night there, the North Vietnamese attacked our perimeter. I just happened to have my tank that night on the northern part of the perimeter. We took turns each night, so that night was my tank's turn to be on the northern part of the Con Tien perimeter, and I took watches along with my crew, 2-hour watches. Any lieutenant that didn't do that with his tank crew would probably have an accident sooner or later. So if you know what I mean. So I had the watch from 2 to 4, and then after I got off my watch, I laid out a blanket on the rear deck of my tank, rear deck back here, and tried to go to sleep, folded up a blanket from my pillow, and shortly after that, something woke me up. Green tracers were snapping over my head. And right away I knew, uh-oh, this is bad. We're under attack. I jumped inside the turret, and I spotted where those traces were coming from, about 800 meters distant. And we put our main gun, I woke everybody up, of course, and put the main gun barrel on that target. And we fired around slightly over where the target should have been.
How big's the gun?
90 millimeter cannon.
Okay.
And the second round we fired, second round was a direct hit, and we got no more machine gun fire from that location. But the ground attack commenced, and we were firing our 30 caliber, our 50 caliber, firing our flechette rounds through our flechette is an anti-personnel round that fires little hundreds of little darts. We were firing that, and then the Army had what they called a duster, not a duster. It was it mounted a 450 caliber machine guns on the back of a 6x truck, and they pulled up next to us and they opened up. So with all of the concentrated fire coming from their vehicle and my vehicle, the attack stopped. They never made it through our inner perimeter wire, and then we waited for dawn. And I was sure when the sun came up we were going to see a lot of dead bodies out there. Sun came up, not a single one. They had hauled all their casualties away in the darkness. And then the battalion commander for 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines stopped by and congratulated us. He said, Lieutenant, you guys really did a good job last night. And I sir, thank you. And I knew now that even though our tanks had a reputation for tearing up commo wire and making a lot of noise that drew incoming, they saw us now as an integral part of their defense. And I was very, very relieved and happy about that. September 15th, the rain started. We got 17 inches of rain in 48 hours. And the bunkers flooded out, trenches were flooded. It was really, really bad, but I wasn't there at that time because that morning I had been an escort for an engineer's mine sweep, where they were going to sweep for mines on the road south of Contienne. And so I was clear down at the fire base called Charlie 2, and I was, the infantry that was with us and the engineers, they all contacted their company headquarters, and they said, no, you don't have to go back to Contienne. We'll send a truck out to get you guys. But I had to turn around and go back. So I got about as far as, I stayed 3 days there waiting for the rains to stop. And then when the rain finally stopped, my company commander came out and he said, load up, Jung, we're heading you back up to Contienne. I said, sir, the road has not been swept for mines for the last 3 days. And he said, he gave me the look like, mind your manners, Lieutenant. You've only been out here 5 days, and I'm your company commander, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. So it's, aye, sir. So we loaded up our tanks. There were 2 tanks with me, and then the captain had a tank retriever with him and his Jeep, and they were going to try to retrieve another tank that had been stuck in the mud during this deluge that was right outside the perimeter of Contienne. And we hadn't gone, we had just reached what was called the washout, which was a creek. But once this rain started, the washout became a 25-foot wide raging river. And because of the culvert there that was blocking the rain, the culvert washed away. And one Marine was on there when it happened. He was actually a corpsman, Navy corpsman. he drowned. No, there were no other casualties, but the bottom line was we were cut off. Contian could no longer get resupply on the main supply route. They had to get everything coming in by helicopter. So we by the time we got our tanks approached the what was the washout, it was it was fordable. So we went across, and in the process of getting across, my tank hit a mine. My other tank commander's Staff Sergeant Webb, he hit a mine. And then we finally, here we are. It's getting dark, starting to get dark. We've got two tanks where the track is completely twisted and blown off. And the captain says, well, I'm taking the retriever and we're going up and get that tank that's stuck in the mud. And I said, sir, we need help with that retriever here, because the retriever could help us untangle untwist the tank track. And so we messed around with it. At some point, we started getting sniper fire from the shrub line about 50 yards away. And we opened up and blew that person away, whoever was shooting at us. And then the captain came back and wanted to know, why aren't the tanks short-tracked? And it was getting dark. And
what's that mean, short track?
Short track means that you replace the damaged track and you don't go completely through through all of your wheels. You maybe just hook your track up to go through, say, part way and not go all the way around through your...
So it's a shortcut?
It's a shortcut.
Got it.
It's what they call a field expedient.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll at least get you back to the rear so you can do the regular repair you need to do. And so the company gunnery sergeant that was with the captain decided, well, I'm taking this tank that we pulled out of the mud, we're going to go across. He got down and then he came up the other side of the creek and got stuck. And that was our only way to get out of there. So
He's blocking the way out?
He's blocking the way out. So I had to abandon my two tanks and go on foot with the infantry. We had asked for some infantry support, and they did send a squad out to give us some infantry support while we were trying to fix the tank track.
So what's it like without your tank?
So that night, we hooked up, hand on the belt, the man in front of him, pitch black, could not see the hand in front of your eyes, and we headed off. Well, I happened to have a sergeant in my unit who he was about in his early 30s. He had already been in the Marines in the 50s, got out, worked construction, and then decided to come back in to be part of the Vietnam War. And so Sergeant Howard and I, we had 7 of us, 8 count me, and we would do a head count and pass it up on the radio. So we didn't even have a radio, just passed it up. And what I did is I told all of them, I said, look, you're only going to take the most important things that you own. And so...
From the tank?
From the tanks, like your letter writing gear, your pistol, your most important thing. So Sergeant Howard, he was a chain smoker. He went in his tank, came out with 4 cartons of cigarettes stuffed all over in his pants pockets, shirt pocket. And so that night we were infantry, and I went over to the captain once we settled in, and the infantry captain, and he said, "Congratulations, Lieutenant. I understand you've decided to join the infantry for tonight." And I said, "Well," and I said, "I'm not going to protest this. Say I need to get up to Contian, because we're only about a quarter mile away from Contian at this time." And so I said, "Aye, sir. Will tell us where to sit in. We'll be glad to support you any way we can."
Without a bit.
So then that night it started raining again, and we were situated next to a squad of Marines that had put up some tents, plastic tents, And they invited us to come in because we were just sleeping on the ground. He invited us, this one Lance Corporal invited us to come share his tent. So we crowded in there, Sergeant Howard and me. And then this Marine tossed and turned and had nightmares all night long. I didn't sleep any time at all that night. And once I got up to go check on my other crew members and make sure they were all situated, and I fell in a hole and lost my helmet. But didn't sprain or break anything. When the sun came up the next morning, we got ourselves together, and I thanked the infantry captain for his hospitality, and we went over and found another tank that belonged to the executive officer of Alpha Company, and he gave us a ride back up to Contian. So that was basically it on that washout. I call it the washout fiasco. Our first week in October, the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines was replaced by the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. And some of my tank crewmen were not happy about that because they considered 1-9 a jinxed battalion. And the reason being how they had suffered losses during Operation Buffalo, and seemed like wherever 1-9 went, they took the most casualties. When I did run into a friend of mine, Ted Christian, a friend of mine from the basic school, he was second lieutenant, and he was with Alpha Company 1-9, and we ran into each other. I invited him into my bunker, and we had some coffee and shared some stories. His nickname was Warthog because he had played football for Arkansas State. He was a fullback, and he essentially had no neck. He just had this homely looking face with a large jaw, and so he was called Warthog, and he called me Ice Cream because of my last name, Combe. So I said, "Hey, Warthog, what are you doing?" He says, "Oh, hi, Ice Cream." So we sat and talked for quite a while and had coffee, and then he said, "Hey, well, I got to go do some things." And a little later that afternoon, I wandered over to where his company was located, and I saw him and his company commander and the battalion chaplain all standing outside their bunker, and they were all talking. So I came over and joined in for about a minute, and then I had this feeling wash over me that I would get sometimes that warned me that something bad was about to happen. And I just excused myself, and I got about 20 yards away, and an incoming artillery shell went off right where we had all been standing. It killed Ted, killed the company commander, and interestingly, the battalion chaplain didn't get a scratch on him. So I didn't know this at the time, but as I was headed up to the 1600 hour briefing, I walked by the battalion aid station, and I saw 3 dead Marines laying on their stretchers outside the battalion aid station. They were covered with blankets, and they were there waiting for a helicopter to come in and pick them up. And I noticed that one arm outside on the ground had the same watch that Ted Christian had. So I went into the aid station. I asked the corpsman, "Hey, who are those Marines out there?" He said, "We don't know who they are. They were all killed by this incoming this afternoon." And I said, "Well, I'd like to check out one of them. I think I know who it is." And when he pulled the blanket back, it was Ted. And so I was shocked, and I went back into the bunker, and the chaplain was in there. And he said, "I want you to know, Lieutenant, that I got to Ted in time." And I said, "You got to him in time? He's dead and you got to him in time?" And then I realized that I had said something really awful. And I just turned around, ran back to my bunker. While I was running back there, I saw some human brains on the ground. It was pretty awesome, pretty awful day. Shortly after that, I was promoted. Before that happened, we got bombed on our own lines one night, and that killed a bunch of Marines. That was never supposed to happen. So we'd all concluded that, yep, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines was the Jinx Battalion. The rest of my tour, I did 8 more months at Candian, but it was never like what we had experienced before. I did receive a Purple Heart for wounds received during an incoming mortar attack.
Describe the wound.
I was hit I was holding up binoculars. We were watching an airstrike up in the demilitarized zone, and I had my platoon sergeant right next to me, Gunny Atchison. And I didn't hear anything. All of a sudden, a mortar shell landed right next to the tank. North Vietnamese forward observer had spotted us, and they had that place all zeroed in. And they just called in that one round, landed right next to the tank. I got a piece of shrapnel in my hand, the back of my wrist here. But Gunny, he took a lot of shrapnel. He was medevaced.
Did he survive?
Yeah, he survived.
Great.
But he was hurt pretty bad. I only had this one piece, and I put my thumb over. The blood was squirting out, and I put my thumb over it and ran down to the aid station and said I got hit. And so Corpsman said, "Let me see." And I said, "Stand back." Pulled my thumb up. Nothing. It wasn't bleeding anymore.
So brave.
Yeah. So about July, it was July. It was on my birthday, actually, July 15th of '68. I was on an operation up in the demilitarized zone. It's a major operation called Operation Thor that involved the whole 9th Marines and all of Alpha Company's tanks. And a helicopter landed next to our location, and a shiny new second lieutenant got out, walked over and said, "Lieutenant Cohn, I'm your replacement." And before I could even say goodbye to the rest of the people, I grabbed my stuff, ran over, jumped on the helicopter, and I was out of there. So I went back to Dong Ha, and I was the executive officer of Alpha Company 2nd Tanks for the rest of my tour. When that tour was over in September of '68, I was assigned to Camp Lejeune, and I was made the commanding officer. I'm a 1st lieutenant this time. I was made the commanding officer of Charlie Company 2nd Tank Battalion. And we had the M103A2, what they call the elephant tanks. They were much larger than the M48A3s, or A3s. The M103A2 elephant tanks, they're no longer in the Marine Corps inventory since the 70s, but they were designed to go to war with the Russian tanks if the opportunity, because it fired a 120 millimeter cannon, had a crew of 5, and it weighed probably as much as an Abrams tank weighs now.
Wow.
So that's basically my presentation. I do want to finish with something that I quoted in my book. If you've heard of James Webb, he was a highly decorated Marine officer who served in Vietnam as a rifle platoon leader and a company commander. And later, he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he even was a senator from Virginia. But he wrote this, and it appealed. I can identify with what he's saying here. "When I remember those days and the very young men who spent them with me, I am continually amazed, for these were mostly recent civilians barely out of high school, called up from the cities and farms to do their year in hell and then return. Visions haunt me every day, not of the nightmares of war, but of the steady consistency with which my Marines face their responsibilities, and how uncomplaining most of them were in the face of constant danger. The salty, battle-hardened 20-year-olds teaching green 19-year-olds the intricate lessons of that hostile battlefield. the unerring skill of the young squad leaders as we moved through unfamiliar villages and weed-choked trails in the black of night. The quick certainty with which they moved when coming under enemy fire. Their sudden tenderness when a fellow Marine was wounded and needed help. Their willingness to risk their lives to save other Marines in peril. Get emotional. I am alive today because of their quiet, unaffected heroism. I had the honor of being selected for the local hospital here, what's the name of the
Canyon
hospital?
Vista.
Canyon Vista Hospital.
Medical Center?
They had a wall of honor, and so I was up there for a year as one of the ones elected to be on that hall of honor, and this is what they had posted up there. Okay.
Any parting thoughts? Conclusion?
Well, if you're interested in wanting to read about Contienne, the battle, or if you want to read about Time in the Barrel, my account of the battle for Contienne, both books can be purchased on Amazon. And if you don't want to go through Amazon, you can contact the publisher, University of Alabama Press. This book on Contienne, The Hill of Angels, was published in 2004, and my most recent book was published in 2019.
Can we get any of them locally here at the Warrior Healing Center?
I don't know.
Do you have any you can sell? Autographed copies available?
I have a few copies, yes.
There we go. And you can contact us at the Warrior Healing Center.
That's correct.
Phone number's at the bottom of this screen. Thanks, Jim. Semper Fi.
Thank you.
And this is it from the Warrior Healing Center. Goodbye.